A few more folks are coming in. Terrific. Welcome to the inaugural L. Jackson Newell Liberal Arts and Sciences Lecture Series. My name is Sylvia Torti, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Dean of the Honors College. Among the high points of my time as Dean, I can easily say that tonight is one of them, because I have the opportunity to recognize the work of my esteemed colleague, teacher, and friend, Jack Newell. This lecture series is possible because of a recent endowment created through an anonymous gift and supported by many, many individual donors. These gifts recognize decades of contributions by Jack Newell to education, academic freedom, and the liberal arts and sciences. Through these generous gifts, we celebrate Jack's passion for educating students. Working with Jack, you feel his steadfast commitment to inspire students to live, as he might say, consciously on this planet, to engage with free and critical thought, to develop their individual purposes and ethics, and to feel empowered, or he might say, obligated, to act on the knowledge they gain. For Jack, liberal arts inquiry isn't about reciting the titles and plots of some classic books in order to call oneself learned, but rather a lifelong exploration of self through scholarship, dialogue, community, and actions. Of course, some of the scholarship may be ancient, some more modern, but all the scholars we read are meant to promote thought and dialogue. The books, the texts, are only the starting points. Teaching with Jack, which I have the honor to be doing this year, is about engaging students as co-learners. It's about exploring the past and the present through ideas and lived experiences, to being true to oneself and not only respecting, but celebrating the differences among us. Ultimately, I believe Jack wants us not to take for granted our privileges, to be clearer about our responsibilities, and to keep an open eye for breaches of ethics or challenges to democratic principles. Originally from Ohio, Jack attended Deep Springs College in California. He earned his master's degree at Duke in American history and his doctorate at Ohio State in the history and philosophy of higher education. He taught at Clemson University, Deep Springs College, and the University of New Hampshire before joining the University of Utah faculty in 1974. For 25 years, Jack served the University of Utah as professor of higher education, and for 16 of those years as dean for liberal education. He also served on the founding board of directors of the Bennion Center for Community Service, as editor of the Review of Higher Education, and for 5 years in the 80s, he co-edited with Linda King Newell the scholarly journal Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. In 1995, Jack took a leave from the university to lead Deep Springs College, where he served as president until 2004. Upon returning to the University of Utah as professor emeritus, he resumed teaching, and fortunately for us, he began a series of courses in the Honors College. One of the characteristics of Jack that I most admire is how he lives his values by engaging the broader Utah community. He co-founded and taught in the Clemente program for low-income adults downtown, a program which now, as a partnership between Utah Humanities, the Honors College, Westminster College, and Salt Lake City Community College, has high school versions in both East and West High School. This program serves as a pipeline for first-generation students to higher education. His scholarly output, as best I can tell, has only picked up pace in recent years. His latest books include The Electric Edge of Academe, the saga of Lucien L. Nunn and Deep Springs College. Another one, Hope, Heart, and the Humanities, How a Free College Course is Changing Lives, that he published with Jean Chaney. And most recently, Conscious and Community, which chronicles the lives and contributions of Sterling M. McMurran, Obert C. Tanner, and Lowell L. Bennion, 3 outstanding and influential scholars and leaders on this campus. That volume, published last year, was produced with Bob Goldberg and Linda Newell. Jack has devoted his career to opening minds to new ideas and possibilities, to building vigorous learning communities, and to magnifying the human decency of others, whatever their philosophy or faith. I would like to invite you all to take a moment with me to recognize Jack, to thank him and to congratulate him on the inaugural L. Jackson Newell Liberal Arts and Sciences Lecture. And now my colleague Monisha Pasupati will give the introduction for our speaker this evening.
So it's such a privilege to introduce all of you to this year's inaugural L. Jackson Newell Fellow in the Liberal Arts and Sciences. And that person is Professor Scott Black, also currently serving as the chair of our English department. In giving this introduction, I actually wanted to start by giving you a little bit of additional context about the lecture series, because the idea arose in part from faculty conversations within the Honors College about the value of collective intellectual engagement around common themes. And the way that when we all think together about a common set of questions and issues, the importance and the value of liberal arts and sciences becomes evident to all of us. And this idea was so deeply consistent, as Dean Torti just discussed, with Jack Newell's long and distinguished history, that as the idea for this lecture developed, there was a unanimous sentiment on the faculty to name this lecture series for Jack Newell. So our inaugural fellow, Professor Scott Black, did his bachelor's work at McGill University and his PhD work at Johns Hopkins. He arrived at the University of Utah in 2005 after doing some years at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. He began his career as an 18th century scholar, but he does also work and teach about contemporary fiction, and that's going to be more a focus of today's talk. So his CV provides evidence of distinguished scholarly achievements, including Folger and Mellon fellowships, among others. It also gives evidence of awards for excellent teaching, driven by both colleagues and actually student-initiated awards. And those awards are present over different years and across a wide time span and at both of the institutions where he's been a faculty. And so I think if you look at his resume, if you will, you see a sustained contribution to the liberal arts, both as a scholar and as a teacher. I think another appeal of his work is that he's a broad reader. In some of the works that I looked at in preparing these remarks, I saw not only looking at other scholars in English literature, but also history, and actually some of the people that I refer to in my own work as a developmental psychologist. His newest book just came out from the Virginia University Press, and it's titled Without the Novel, Romance and the History of Prose Fiction. And in this book, Professor Black writes and asks us to imagine, what is fiction without the novel? And what is literary history without the novel? What is reading without the novel? So these questions made me curious, and I read a little more. And one of the questions in this work is the contrast between the idea of a novel as progressing over history towards greater realism, versus what he sometimes talks about as the enduring life of the romance. And the romance are these tales of adventure and chivalry. And that enduring life of the romance happens in part because we ordinary readers derive so much joy from immersing ourselves in those worlds. And that joy even happens in books like Don Quixote, where although we're transported by the story is actually about the folly of being transported. So it's not such a huge leap from Don Quixote to the world of speculative fiction and contemporary fiction. And the talk today represents a new project for Professor Black, one dealing with the fiction of Ursula K. LeGuin. And it's this project that captivated the selection committee, and partly that's because the project addresses how Le Guin's fiction intersects with pressing modern issues like conflicts between people and societal dilemmas about resources and our ability to control our own destinies. And it's partly because he continues a sustained focus on the experience of readers as valuable, meaningful, and informative to literary scholars. So we're so fortunate to have Professor Black here to lead us on an exploration of these ideas. And I think you will all agree with the selection committee that his combination of scholarship, teaching, and engagement with readers made him an excellent choice to represent the enduring value of the liberal arts and sciences. So please help me welcome and congratulate our inaugural L. Jackson Newell Fellow, Professor Scott Black.
So how is that? You can hear me? First of all, thank you, Sylvia, Monisha, and especially Jack. It's a great honor to be presenting the inaugural Jackson Newell lecture. I'm going to jump right in. Ursula K. LeGuin was one of the most significant American writers of the last half century. The author of popular and award-winning science fiction and fantasy works, and an important feminist innovator in those male-dominated fields, she has been a formative influence on a broad range of writers, from Margaret Atwood, Neil Gaiman, and Roberto Bolaño, to David Mitchell, Junot Diaz, and N.K. Jemisin. She has not been an influence on J.K. Rowling, despite coming up with the idea of a school for wizards 30 years before Harry Potter. Nevertheless, Le Guin is now celebrated as a major American author and published in the Library of America. Today I'll discuss some recurring patterns in Le Guin's novels and stories. I'm going to move quickly through several of her books to show some of the dynamics that have defined her career. I'll only be able to give quick sketches of some rich and profound works. If you know them, you'll see what I've left out. If you don't, I hope I'll convince you to read them. But first, I want to start with a broad question, one I won't address directly, but leave in the background. What kind of stories do we need now? As we learn how fragile our planet's life support systems are, we need alternatives to the habits of mastery and control that have brought us to our current crisis. What kind of stories will help us live more carefully on a damaged Earth? Le Guin is best known for her young adult Earthsea novels and her science fiction books of the Hainish cycle. She kept adding to these series throughout her career, and that's the first pattern I want to note, her habit of revisiting and revising her earlier work. Le Guin was a searching, philosophical writer, and her books are dynamic thought experiments with possible worlds. One of her classic novels, The Dispossessed, is about an anarchist society. Another, The Left Hand of Darkness, is set on a world without different sexes. These alternative biological and social orders allow Le Guin to run narrative experiments that explore how personal relations, sexuality, and politics might work without defined gender roles and without private property. These novels are set in the Hainish universe, which is made up of distant worlds brought together in a federation of planets called the Ecumen. The Earthsea series works differently. It's a single world, though it has plenty of cultural and racial diversity, and it's a fantasy world with magic, wizards, and dragons. Sadly, I will not be talking about the dragons this evening. Earthsea is also the space for some of Le Guin's most interesting narrative experiments, her laboratory for exploring stories. The original trilogy, A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Adawan, and The Farthest Shore, follows the life and adventures of Ged, a poor shepherd from the remote island of Gaunt, who becomes the most powerful wizard in Earthsea. Each of these books tells the story of a young person coming of age, and as such books usually are, they are heroic adventure stories with extraordinary protagonists facing various ordeals. But though Le Guin works with this foundational, even mythical pattern, she always does so with a twist. In the first book, she shifts the focus from the conquest of an external enemy to the acceptance of oneself. In the second, she makes the hero a young woman. This is 1971, when speculative fiction was almost completely dominated by men. And in the third, the final ordeal cost the hero all his power. The Earthsea trilogy was hugely popular and beloved by generations of readers, including me. It broadened the possibilities of fantasy and offered more inclusive and more complicated stories than the usual compensatory heroics of sword and sorcery tales. But For all their innovations, these were still adventure stories. And as the series ends, with Ged riding off into the sunset, on a dragon no less, he's still very much the traditional hero in a conventional adventure story. 18 years after the original trilogy, LeGuin returned to Earthsea to re-examine and reconsider it. In those years, of course, a lot had happened, and the next book reflects what LeGuin had learned from feminism and her own thinking about narrative. Tehanu picks up the story of Ged as he learns to deal with the loss of his magical powers after he returns to Gaunt, where Tanar, the heroine of the Tombs of Adawan, is living with her adopted daughter, Tehanu. This is a different kind of novel, not a story about growing up, but about growing old. Instead of heroic deeds, it explores their costs and consequences. There is a subplot about the young Tehanu discovering who she is, but that story is at the margins of the main story. At the margins of the main story of Tanar and Ged, who are coming to terms as a woman and an ordinary man with the limits of their power. Looking back on Tehanu in 2012, LeGuin wrote that she needed to look at Earthsea from outside and underneath, from the point of view of people who are not included, the ones who can't do magic. Both Tanar and Ged are in positions of weakness, and the book continually returns to questions about the nature and limits of power. In caring for the deeply traumatized Tehanu, Tanar is brought to the realization that there was nothing she could do to help her, but there was always the next thing to be done. There are always chores and the obligations of taking care of the household. Tehanu enmeshes us in the complexities of domestic spaces and their endless negotiations between what you can and can't control. In its very form and structure as well, the novel forsakes the gratifications of action and fantasy's freedoms of magic and wizardry. Instead, the book focuses on those aspects of life that are usually ignored in conventional adventure stories. There is some action and some suspense, but the real drama of the book is the developing relationship of the two older people, who, as older people do, mostly sit around and talk. Here, LeGuin is using her world of fantasy to interrogate the roots of fantasy, our need for power and control, and exploring how to come to terms with the reality of having to live without them. This turn reflects LeGuin's evolving ideas about storytelling, which are presented in her influential essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. In this essay, she imagines the earliest stories as being told by men bragging about their hunting adventures. But not everyone goes hunting, and LeGuin asks, what about all the other things we do to survive? Those less heroic, less glamorous, and less masculine activities like gathering food or caring for children. We've heard it, she writes. We've heard all about the sticks and spears and swords, the things to bash and hit and poke with, the long, hard things. But we have not heard about the thing to put things in, the container for the thing contained. That is a new story. What would a story based on those other tools look like? Those tools that don't drive energy out, but bring energy home. Baskets, packs, pots. LeGuin says, the reduction of narrative to conflict is absurd, and she asks for the other story, the untold one, the life story. Tehanu is one of her first experiments in writing a story based on the carrier bag theory of fiction. With Tehanu, LeGuin begins to work through the problem of how to write a good story about staying at home, exploring the narrative possibilities of ongoingness, the realities of having to deal with defeat and injury, and the challenges of caring for the wounded and traumatized. Not the glorious tragedy of great heroes, but the comedy of survival that the rest of us live. I'll return now to the Hainish cycle and consider how LeGuin continues this line of narrative experimentation in its terms. In Tehanu, the adventure is at the margin, and the novel centers on Ged and Tanar as they come to terms with the limits of their power and begin a new relationship. This pattern is echoed in the first two stories of 4 Ways to Forgiveness. When it was first published in 1995, this collection consisted of 4 loosely linked stories set on the twin worlds of Werrell and Yahweh. Werrell was a slave-holding planet, and Yahweh was originally colonized by mining corporations using slave labor. After a long and bloody rebellion, Yahweh achieved independence, inspiring further slave revolts on Werrell itself. The stories are set during these tumultuous times on both planets. 4 years later, in 1999, LeGuin revisits this world and adds a final story to the original 4. It's that final edition I'm especially interested in. The first 2 stories of Ways to Forgiveness throw together people from different worlds. In the first story, a retired school administrator meets a disgraced political leader trying to live with his shame for having betrayed his party. As with Tehanu, 2 people are dealing with the loss of their power, and the story tells of their developing relationship. It also continues Tehanu's experiment in refocusing attention away from adventure. The central events of the story are simple: an illness, a fire, and the really dramatic events are told only as memories. Again, LeGuin is more interested in the costs and consequences of adventure than in the action itself. The story explores how people come to terms with constrained lives, and it ends, like Tehanu, with a hard-earned relationship. The next story is another variation on this pattern, but here the constraints are intensified as 2 people who hate each other are kidnapped and thrown together in prison. Again, the central incident is simple, and the dramatic action, war, and revolution takes place at the margins. The story focuses on 2 people dealing with each other across different cultures and opposing values. The first part is told from the point of view of Sali, a cosmopolitan representative of the Ecumen who has just arrived on Werrell. She is a tough, liberated woman, and while she is fascinated by the Werrellian people, she is disgusted by their slave-holding culture, which she sees personified in her bodyguard, Teyeo's militarism, propriety, and misogyny. But then the narrative perspective shifts, and as we learn Teyeo's backstory, we realize how much Sali misunderstands him. He misunderstands her in turn, seeing her as spoiled, arrogant, and ignorant. Once we've gotten to know the 2 characters, they're kidnapped, imprisoned, and forced to confront each other, stripped of their habitual assumptions. Under these extreme circumstances, Sali comes to appreciate Teyeo's restraint and learns from him how to shut up and sit still. Teyeo comes to appreciate Sali's bravery and learns from her how to open up and express himself. These are familiar dynamics for LeGuin, the silent need to learn to speak and the loud to shut up. After these 2 experiments with minimal plotting and the narrative possibilities of stasis, arrest, and confinement, LeGuin turns to 2 widescreen life stories. These paired stories again bring together people from radically different worlds, but here the emphasis is on the lives that led to their relationship. The first of these stories, A Man of the People, is about Havshiva, an envoy of the Ecumen. The second, A Woman's Liberation, is about Rakam, an escaped slave from Werrell. Their stories are complementary and center around issues of leaving home. Havshiva comes from a village on Hain, a small, stable, self-contained community, but he is a curious, restless boy and chooses to go away to school, eventually becoming an envoy of the ecumen. His family is upset and think his leaving is a failure for them. They live in what the Hainish call local time, and they value local knowledge. But in leaving home, Havshiva chooses universal knowledge in what the Hainish call historical time. These two kinds of time and knowledge also suggest two kinds of stories. Stories of going out, exploring, and adventure, and stories about staying put, being embedded, and working within complexity. Havshiva's story is all about leaving home, but as it develops, it ends up being about him finding a new home and learning the value of what he left behind. At the end, he says, you can't change anything from the outside. Standing apart, looking down, taking the overview, you see the pattern, what's wrong, what's missing. You want to fix it, but you can't patch it. You have to be in it, weaving it. You have to be part of the weaving. The story subtly undermines its own impulse as Havshiva travels to a new world to find the value of the home he left, and learns that only by staying put can he find what he left to find. Curiosity and exploration lead him to appreciate staying still. Leaving home is a kind of metaphoric freedom for Havshiva, a broadening of horizons for an inquisitive, restless kid. But leaving home is a much more literally liberating experience for Rakam. Born a slave, Rakam frees herself through literacy, books, and history, which allow her to understand that her circumstances aren't the only reality. I had grown up without any history. There was nothing in the plantations but the way things were. Nobody knew anything about any time when things had been different. Nobody knew there was any place where things might be different. We were enslaved to the present time. History allows Rakam to see that life doesn't have to be the way it is. But even when she's escaped slavery and left Werrell, she still has to learn to live freely in her own body. She says, it may be in our sexuality that we are most easily enslaved, men and women. It may be there, even as free men and women, that we find freedom hardest to keep. The politics of the flesh are the roots of power. For both Havshiva and Rakam, problems may be identified from the outside, but they must be addressed from the inside, from the intimacy of the local pattern, and from the intimacy of the body, where you live your history and find your freedom. This point is summed up in the stunning paragraph Rakam ends her story with. I have told the story I was asked to tell. I have closed it, as so many stories close, with the joining of two people. What is one man's and one woman's love and desire against the history of two worlds, the great revolutions of our lifetimes, the hope, the unending cruelty of our species? A little thing, but a key is a little thing next to the door it opens. If you lose the key, the door may never be unlocked. It is in our bodies that we lose or begin our freedom, in our bodies that we accept or end our slavery. In the intimacies of our lives, we live history. How we live in our most intimate moments is a political act. This is a fundamental insight of feminism, and LeGuin gives it beautiful form at the end of these stories. The paragraph also serves as a kind of ars poetica, a summing up of LeGuin's practice of storytelling from Tehanu to 4 Ways of Forgiveness. It tells us why we need life stories to understand history and how love offers a key to new historical possibilities. Rakam's story ends on a note of hope, giving us a taste of the possibilities of freedom, a promise of the transformative potential of love. And yet, as she did with Tehanu, LeGuin returns to this world to add another story that deepens and complicates the hopeful resolution. This final story, Old Music and the Slave Women, takes place after a woman's liberation, in the middle of a civil war on Werrol. It's about Esden, who's known as Old Music on this world, an Ecumen intelligence officer who has helped Rakam escape from Werrol to Yahweh. At the beginning of the story, Old Music leaves the safety of the Ecumen embassy and is immediately kidnapped, brought to the plantation house of an old estate, tortured, and held captive. That's the plot. Not much happens, and the story is both about confinement and very confined itself. Outside the estate and at the margins of the narrative, the civil war rages. Old Music's original captors are attacked by another splinter group of rebels who are themselves attacked, possibly by the main army of the rebellion, but it's not clear. The story, though, stays centered on Old Music's very limited perspective. And while there's a lot of dramatic action at the edges, the characters don't know what's going on, and we share their confusion. Like Forgiveness Day, the plot centers on a kidnapping. Like A Man of the People, it involves a Hainish man living on Werrol. And like A Woman's Liberation, it explores the lives of enslaved people. But here, the constraints are intensified even further. LeGuin strips her plot down to almost nothing, again focusing on the relationships formed within bondage. In this case, the slow and hesitant friendship developing between Old Music and the slave women, Ghana, Kamsa, and Kamsa's baby, Rekam. The echo of Rakam's name in the baby brings us back to her childhood as a slave. But unlike Rakam's story, this one never leaves the slave quarters. And unlike the earlier story, this one does not have a redemptive romance. It doesn't close with the joining of two people. It doesn't offer the key of love to unlock the history of suffering. And it doesn't give us a hopeful resolution. Like Tehanu, Old Music and the Slave Women focuses on coming to terms with limits and powerlessness. But here, LeGuin compresses and sharpens the experiment. If Ged has to learn to live an ordinary life without his magical powers, Old Music has to survive without even the ordinary freedoms of agency. The slave women teach him those lessons. The plantation he's held on reminds Old Music of his childhood home on Hain. In a thematically central flashback, he thinks about his cousin Suhan, who had been born with irreparable brain defects. Old Music remembers wondering how anyone could really love Suhan. To the adolescent Esden, it was still a problem. His cousin Noi, Suhan's sister, told him it was not a problem but a mystery. "You see how Suhan is our guide," she said. "Look at it. He led my parents to live here, so my sister and I were born here. So you come to stay with us, so you've learned to live in the Pueblo. You'll never be just a city man, because Suhan guided you here, guided us all into the mountains." "He didn't really guide us," the 14-year-old argued. "Yes, he did. We followed his weakness, his incompleteness. Failures open. Look at water, Ezzy. It finds the weak places in the rock, the openings, the hollows, the absences. Following water, we come to where we belong." This is a remarkable passage, and one that packs a lot into some very simple language. Noi's comments here refer to a central image of the ancient Chinese classic, the Tao Te Ching. Let's pause and consider that context. LeGuin was deeply interested in the Tao Te Ching. She published her own version in 1997, 2 years before this story, and she says she lived with the book her whole life. The influence of the Tao Te Ching can be heard throughout her work, but rarely as clearly as here. There are thousands of translations and commentaries of the Tao Te Ching, and it probably needs little introduction. But here's a brief overview of some of its elements that are important for LeGuin. Literally, the book Qing of the way, Tao, and skill, Te. The Tao Te Ching is not a series of doctrines, but a book about an attitude, a perspective, a way of being in the world. At its core are the simple cycles of light and dark, or yang and yin, which revolve like the moon, waxing and waning, and then waxing and waning again. The Tao Te Ching advocates equanimity and stability in the midst of this flux, like being at the hub around which the spokes of a wheel rise and fall, and practicing wu wei, non-coercive action, spontaneous action, free of ingrained habits, and so attuned to whatever circumstances you find yourself in. As one commentator says, when it is cold, wander in the cold. When it is hot, wander in the heat. The less of your habitual reactions you bring to a situation, the more responsive you can be. And a Taoist seeks to quiet her impulses and calm her desires so she can act harmoniously. The Tao Te Ching is a series of exercises to help you learn to take things as they are instead of how you want them to be. The Tao Te Ching is not about being passive, but about being responsive. Another commentator says, the sage merely speaks of doing what one should do to the utmost according to one's situation. Indeed, the Tao Te Ching was written during a period of political crisis, the bloody and violent centuries of the warring states period of Chinese history. A pair of scholars describe it like this. It was in response to those darkest days in which the blood of China's children irrigated the crops and their flesh fertilized the land that the Tao Te Ching emerged as an alternative vision of what the human experience might be like. The world was wasting away, and the Tao Te Ching was a mysterious elixir that offered to serve as its restorative. Another scholar says that the Taoist practices Wu Wei because he sees spreading all around him the vicious circles of lying, hatred, and violence. His aim is not merely to avoid starting new circles, but to interrupt those that have already started. Through his peculiar behavior, he hopes to save the world. The basic idea is, as your mind calms down, the world calms down. For this reason, the Tao Te Ching emphasizes the qualities of yin, the waning parts of the cycle, the dark, the weak, the low, in order to counteract the inevitable impulses of energy, anger, aggression, selfishness, which flare up when things don't go the way we want or expect them to, and things never go the way we want or expect them to. The Tao Te Ching helps us cultivate an attitude of receptive responsiveness, an ongoing dynamic achievement of equilibrium, fluid, attuned, accommodating. Sarah Allen calls the Tao Te Ching the way of water, and LeGuin says it is itself praise and enjoyment of the spirit of yin, the water soul that yields, follows, eludes, and leads on, dancing in 100 valleys. Here are a couple verses in LeGuin's versions. Nothing in the world is as soft, as weak as water. Nothing else can wear away the hard, the strong, and remain unaltered. Soft overcomes hard. Weak overcomes strong. Everybody knows it. Nobody uses the knowledge. True goodness is like water. Water's good for everything. It does not compete. It goes right to the low, loathsome places, and so finds the way. Images of water flow throughout old music and the slave women. When old music first talks to Kamsa, he tells her that her baby will be free, meaning that slavery has been abolished by the revolution. Kamsa answers, yes, he will be free. Later he learns from Ghana that the baby is dying from a disease called Avo. Old music is shocked and cries out that Avo is curable. But then he realizes it's curable where there are doctors and medicine and in the city, but not here in the country, in the slave quarters. Ghana says, I was born owned, and my daughters, but he was not. He is the gift to us. Nobody can own him. Old music realizes that when Kamsa repeated that her baby would be free, she had meant he would be free in dying. Later he thinks, this baby was dying of a disease that could be cured by a mere series of injections. It was wrong to accept his illness, his death. It was wrong to let him be cheated out of his life by circumstance, bad luck, an unjust society, a fatalistic religion. He should interfere. He should do something. What could be done? But then he realizes there was nothing they could do, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Neither anger nor hope served any purpose, nor grief. It was not the time for grief yet. Rekam was here with them, and they would delight in him as long as he was here, as long as his life. This was a strange place to come to learn the quality of joy. Water is my guide, he thought. His hand still felt what it had been like to hold the child, the light weight, the brief warmth. The baby, like his cousin Suhan, is his guide in powerlessness and weakness. He thought about what he could do. He found nothing. He was weak as water, helpless as the baby. And later, I've outlived my usefulness, he thought, and the thought went through him like a shaft of clear light. He had kept thinking there was something he could do. There wasn't. At the end of the story, there's a fierce battle. We don't know who's fighting. And old music hides in a cellar with his friends. After the battle, they emerge and still don't know what's happened. Most of the field hands have left to meet the approaching army of the liberation. But old music stays with Ghana and Kamsa. As the story ends, he learns that the baby Rekam has died. He stood a while longer in the gateway and then went in to do what there was for him to do, dig a grave for the child and wait with the others for the liberation. Think about the difference between this ending and the end of the original volume, that paragraph about the key of love opening the locked door of history. The original stories had a nicely balanced shape, bringing together characters from different worlds in love and hope. But then LeGuin returns to disrupt that balance with an additional story that offers little hope and ends in uncertainty. Why does she do this? Why does LeGuin upend her beautiful design by adding this final stark story, which doesn't resolve its problems and leaves us with more questions than answers? The challenge of the carrier bag theory of fiction was to tell a less exclusively outward moving story. And Tehanu and 5 Ways to Forgiveness seek to complement the flow of adventure with the ebb of coming home. They're stories attentive to the other side of adventure, not just going out to become oneself, but learning to live with and within oneself, coming to terms with history in the intimacy of your body, and learning your place in a pattern. There's a Taoist dimension to this as well. Return is how the way moves. Weakness is how the way works. In her later stories, LeGuin gives shape to these waning tendencies, telling stories of coming to rest, coming to terms with the limits of power, coming to peace with where you are, being like water. In Old Music and the Slave Women, LeGuin is further experimenting with a Taoist practice of storytelling, one that seeks to offer an experience of acceptance as well as narrate it. This is not just a story about coming home, but seeks to suspend our usual yearnings to know, to understand, even to hope. The 12th century Taoist Yang Wan Li compared poetry to tea. Poetry will neutralize the thousands of words and thoughts one comes upon in life. Good tea does not stir up all the tastes of the meal one has just had, and good poetry does not stir up all the words, feelings, and thoughts that one deals with on a daily basis. Good tea and good poetry are similar in their soothing and emptying effects. Yang is talking about a gently astringent green tea, which cleanses your palate after a meal. Like tea, his poetry calms our habitual reactions, thoughts, and feelings. I think LeGuin is after something similar. Her stories certainly mean to stretch our imaginations, challenge us morally, and exercise our empathy. But at times, they also seek to calm the restlessness, the curiosity, the very craving for adventure, excitement, and satisfaction that drives us to read stories in the first place. We followed his weakness, his incompleteness. Failures open. Look at water. It finds the weak places in the rock, the openings, the hollows, the absences. Following water, we come to where we belong. Like the others in Ways to Forgiveness before him, Old Music finds where he belongs, but his is a sharper, clearer lesson. His realization of his weakness goes through him like a shaft of clear light. He had kept thinking there was something he could do. There wasn't. The story finally gives us nothing but that clarity of understanding, a chance to live with the reality of fragility. Old Music finds a place to stay, not the place he wants, not the place of his hopes or desires, but the place he is. And as the story unwinds the spell it weaves, it leaves us too, waiting, empty, attentive, aware, and just leaves it there.
I think Professor Black would be happy to answer some questions if anyone has any.
Yes.
So I haven't read the five ways to forgiveness, but one phrase that you brought up several times was dramatic action at the edges of the story.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you think that the LeGuin's attempts to make stories that are free from conflict, or at least traditional conflict, is kind of undermined by having the conflict just be at the peripheries of the story? There's still kind of that driving force of there's a conflict somewhere. We're just
Right.
in a bottle that isn't seen.
Yeah, did you hear the question? The question was whether by leaving the conflict at the edge of the stories, LeGuin is not really getting beyond conflict, but just bottling it up. Like, I think that's right. I think there are plenty of stories that simply do without conflict and sort of deal with real domestic spaces, the challenges of really ordinary life. I mean, that's one tradition of the realist novel. LeGuin, I think, is really self-consciously writing these particular stories. At least she has a ton of different kinds of stories that do lots of different things. But in these particular stories, I think she's really self-consciously thinking about alternatives to adventure while marking them as alternatives to adventure. And that's part of that's part of her revision of traditional genre fiction, in this case, sci-fi. This is very much part of her science fiction universe. And she's thinking about, the conventions of this particular form of fiction and trying to write against it. I don't think, she does have realist works that do what realist works does. This one, that sort of leaving the adventure at the margins is part of the gesture of writing against it. So that's as best as I can tell. And it's also interesting because as the sort of Hainish stories go along through her career, she's doing this increasingly, she's marginalizing the adventure increasingly. But frankly, she would lose the audience of her Hainish universe if she just lost it altogether. And I think it would be a less rich experiment. Part of the experiment is to have readers go in with these expectations, the genre conventions, and then gently persuade them to think about it. And you don't do that just by throwing away the conventions altogether. Jeremy.
I love that, Scott, and I loved where you left it. Maybe in a place of unresolved tension, but I'm going to make you or ask you.
Oh no.
I think there's a lot to recommend it. What you and LeGuin are telling us about weakness and accepting our weakness, our powerlessness, certainly as an alternative to a lot of what fiction often glamorizes, is precisely the opposite of the kind of power we have. I guess I'm wondering if you want to speak to the picture of the world you put up there in a world in crisis. And I guess we're at a moment where I think there are some other, very compelling voices. I'm thinking of Greta Thunberg and the climate strike that she's organizing and that tomorrow is happening here. I'm thinking of the Parkland survivors who are going to be here on Saturday. Their message is quite contrary, that you can make a difference, that you can do something, even if you're a kid.
Right.
How do you think we balance this unity?
How do you balance it? Yeah, right. Is that all?
Well,
no, I'm joking. I mean, is that all we have to talk about?
The message of weakness as opposed to the message of
right.
activism.
Yeah, and I did frame the whole talk by saying this is one of the kinds of stories we need now. I want to say two things. I don't think it's the only kind of story we need now, but I do think it's an important mood, it's an important way of thinking about ourselves that's largely missing from our culture at this moment. And I think with disastrous effects, because the idea that we can imagine, I want to go back. The important thing about LeGuin's stories here is they're about limits. And I think in thinking about, the climate catastrophe, we have to recognize we're working within limits. It's the refusal to understand those limits that's gotten us where we are right now. For someone like LeGuin, for other people who are very influenced by her, Donna Haraway, Amitav Ghosh, it's the stories of our power that have gotten us here, our inability to think about ourselves in other ways. I think what LeGuin is offering are stories that remind us that that's not the only way we have traditionally to think about ourselves, and it's important to recognize those limits. Frankly, in order to do whatever you have to do, simple activism is not a good idea. Driving aggression with aggression is not a good idea. You have to recognize where you are. And part of the problem with the global climate catastrophe is we don't know where we are. We haven't stopped to think about not what we need and what we want, but what the earth needs and what the earth wants. We're unable to hear it, even though it's screaming quite loudly. So I think what someone like LeGuin is trying to do is get us to calm what we think we know in order to understand, first, the limits of that, but also be attentive to what's going on beyond us. And she also is very aware, not particularly in these stories, but in other stories, of the greater than human world, which has a real presence in some of her works that requires us not to sort of talk to it, but to try to hear it. And that requires us to quiet ourselves so that we can be attentive to this. So this is not, there's no single answer to what's going on right now. You need to do many, many things. You need to go to the strike tomorrow, for instance. You all should be going to the climate strike tomorrow. And, but that's not all. That's, we have this idea that we're going to act our way out of this. I actually think we will not act our way out of this. We will only find our way out of it when we let the healing happen. It's not what we can do. Healing we don't heal things. We let healing happen. It's those larger dynamics that get called the Tao, or they get called the Way, or they get called the Earth. It doesn't really matter. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on. Yes?
So while reading Five Ways to Forgiveness, I found it almost depressing how relevant some of the issues were
Yeah.
today, such
Yeah.
as the corruption of the planet now with the capitalist strip mining and shipping male slaves. And I was just wondering your take on how those warnings essentially tie into an overall message of the book.
It's a good question, and if you've read it, you'll know that I've sort of taken a particular path through these stories. There's a lot more to say about them. A lot's going on. They're written in the 90s, and so they're not that far away. And she's very, one of the reflections of the books is on a kind of really brutal, extractive capitalism. In this case, done with slave labor, which may be sort of, I was going to say maybe ramping up the intensity, but not really. So it would be very possible to do a different kind of reading of these books, and it would be very interesting and legitimate to do a different kind of reading, focusing on the sort of social critique and the critiques of gender, which are really important also, and also the really interesting racial twists. In this particular world, the black people are the owners and the white people are the slaves. So there's all kinds of different things to say about that. I haven't addressed that here, but I think they're really important. One of the things that LeGuin's doing in these stories is giving us sort of half real context to run her stories through. She always does that. They always have one foot in some kind of issue that she's thinking about in our world. And in a sense, setting those problems on a different world allows her a kind of laboratory to see what would happen by sort of tweaking one of our presumptions or one of the facts of our reality. So I talked about the sort of non-binary gender world, just asking the question, what would happen if we didn't have gender? What would happen if we actually had an anarchist society? What would happen in the case of Werrell and Yahweh if we actually had a planet of resources that we could fully exploit? And then what would happen if all those slaves actually decided that they wanted freedom? And so those kind of experiments, I think, are very much about issues, and you should be recognizing they're issues we are facing now. These are sort of thought experiments and sort of running through how one might live in such a world and how we as readers sort of experience those realities at a slight remove. One more question. Yes?
So kind of the example you were talking about, using how she talks about more of the context and the life based on, you base your stories on real world life experiences more than conflict. Do you think the container and weapon sort of juxtaposition is also a comment on feminism?
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. The question is whether the sort of distinction she makes between container and weapon is a comment on feminism. Yeah, absolutely. That story from the 80s is very much the sort of product of her mature thinking about feminists. And she was a very important feminist in the second generation, second wave feminism in the 70s and 80s. And that story is coming right out of those discussions in feminism. And yeah, absolutely, you know, sticks and pots, I don't have to do the reading for you. But yeah, I think the carrier bag theory of fiction is a feminist intervention in how stories are told. And you know, I've actually left out the story that really performs that experiment. It's not these. I think these are important sort of effects of that, but her book, a fascinating, really complex book that no one reads because it's long and hard, is called Always Coming Home. What is it called? Is that right, Jeremy? Always Coming Home. That sounds wrong, but anyhow. That's a story where she actually tries to do a story in a sort of embedded series of pot structures, like nested dolls, without any kind of driving adventure at all, really. Or that's really contained within one of the pots. So yeah, it's absolutely feminist, and it's formal as well, and sort of thinking about what a feminist story might sound like on the assumption that most of the stories we're telling ourselves now are really inflected by, you know, traditions of patriarchy, therefore sexism. So thanks, excellent question. I think we're done. Thanks very much.